Anne Askew wasn't born to burn. She was born into nobility in 1521. The daughter of Sir William Askew, a wealthy landowner and former sheriff in Lincolnshire, England. Her life was meant to be one of quiet privilege, silk gowns, arranged marriages, and the rituals of English high society. But Anne Askew never followed the script. Her faith, her fiery, stubborn, dangerous faith would take her far from the halls of nobility and into the darkest corners of Tudor brutality. England at the time was in religious chaos. King Henry VIII had broken away from the Catholic Church to form the Church of England. But the dust hadn't settled. Power shifted daily. Protestants and Catholics warred in secret and in court. Heresy was a word that changed definition depending on who wore the crown, and had been married off to Thomas Come, a Catholic. But she never accepted him. She had wanted to take her sister's place in that arranged match, but not as a docile wife. From early on, and was drawn not to fashion or court games, but to scripture. She devoured the Bible. She questioned sermons. She challenged priests. And most dangerously, she began preaching her beliefs openly in a world where women were barely allowed to read theology. She dared to teach it. Her marriage crumbled. Thomas Come eventually kicked her out for her outspoken Protestantism, and responded by heading straight for London, the political and religious heart of the nation. But she didn't go to hide. She went to be heard, dressed in widow's black, with fierce eyes and verses on her lips, and began circulating among Protestant circles. She spoke at small gatherings. She handed out forbidden tracts, and she read the Bible aloud in English, a crime for women in many parts of the kingdom. She wasn't just practicing her faith. She was provoking the system, and it noticed. In 1545, she was arrested for the first time. Questioned, warned, released. But she didn't stop. 2 years later, in 1546, she was arrested again, this time with a different tone. She wasn't just a nuisance now. She was a threat, and threats were crushed. She was taken to the Tower of London, interrogated repeatedly, pressured to name names. They believed she was connected to the Queen's circle, Queen Catherine Parr, a Protestant sympathizer herself, and was suspected of being a messenger, maybe even a conspirator. But she refused to betray anyone. And so, they brought the rack. The rack wasn't just a tool, it was a declaration. When logic failed and confessions didn't come, the rack was wielded, a long wooden frame, cranks at both ends. The prisoner was tied at the wrists and ankles, then stretched, slowly, incrementally, until joints cracked, until muscles tore, until the body could no longer contain itself, and was tortured personally under the watch of Lord Chancellor Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich, two of the most powerful men in England. And they did something shocking. They turned the rack themselves. For hours, they pulled her body until her shoulders and hips dislocated, her bones separated from their sockets, her spine pulled taut like rope ready to snap. She passed out from the pain. They revived her and did it again and again. She never screamed. She never named anyone. Anne Askew's body was ruined. She couldn't walk. She couldn't sit upright. Her limbs dangled like broken branches. She had to be carried back to her cell. And even then, she wrote. Using charcoal and trembling hands, she recorded her thoughts on scraps of parchment. Her words, collected later and smuggled out, are now considered among the earliest female author prose in English Protestant history. She wrote about faith, about silence, about fear, and about strength. She knew she would die, but she wanted to control how, and was sentenced to death by burning. Heresy was her crime. She would be tied to a stake at Smithfield and burned before the crowd. But there was a problem. She couldn't stand, so they brought her to the stake on a chair, not walking, not pleading, just watching. They tied her broken body upright with chains. 2 men supported her as they lashed iron bands around her chest and waist to keep her from collapsing. Her face was pale, her eyes alert around her. 3 other men were also sentenced to burn. 2 priests and a tailor, each accused of Protestant beliefs. But all eyes were on Anne. She didn't weep. She didn't scream. She waited. Then, the fire was lit. The dry wood crackled instantly. Flames rose fast, dancing up the hem of her dress. The heat spread upward, licking her legs, wrapping around her waist. But she didn't cry out. Witnesses said she whispered prayers even as the smoke blackened her skin. The flames grew tall. The crowd watched as the fire consumed her. Her hands, still bound, curled into fists. Her eyes stayed open longer than anyone expected. And then, finally, the fire claimed her. She was 25 years old. Anne Askew was the first woman to be tortured in the Tower of London. She was the only one to be both racked and burned, and she never named a single soul. Her writings survived, carried out by secret sympathizers, printed by Protestant presses, smuggled into households like relics. Her poems and court examinations spread across Europe. She became a symbol not just of Protestant courage, but of female resistance, a woman who defied marriage, defied silence, and defied pain, and they burned her for it. In the days after Anne Askew's execution, London buzzed. Some called her a heretic, others whispered the word saint, but all agreed no woman had ever died like her. No woman had ever been broken so completely and still refused to bend. King Henry VIII, nearing the end of his reign, remained silent on the event. But behind the scenes, the pressure from Anne's execution spread fear in his own court. Rumors swirled that Queen Catherine Parr, known for her Protestant leanings, had been on the edge of arrest herself. She narrowly escaped interrogation, allegedly by submitting to the king's authority in time. And silence had bought others protection, or at least delay. Anne's legacy wasn't forged in rebellion. It was forged in restraint. She didn't pick up weapons. She didn't lead armies. She spoke. She read. She stood for what she believed in and refused to recant, even as her joints were pulled apart and her flesh seared in fire. She once wrote, "I would rather to die than to break my faith." And so she did. The state didn't just execute her, it tried to erase her. But every act of violence they inflicted only made her voice louder. Her words were printed in books like the Examinations of Anne Askew and the Latra Examination, both of which spread widely after her death. Those pages bore her testimony, unfiltered, passionate, fearless. She criticized the clergy. She defended her beliefs with scripture. She told her torturers nothing, and she addressed every accusation with precision and calm. Even under the rack, she was a scholar. Even in the fire, she was a writer. Today, she is remembered not just as one of the first English female poets, but as a theologian in her own right. Her refusal to conform, as a woman, as a Protestant, and as a thinker, made her dangerous. But that danger came from her mind, not her sword. Her death at Smithfield was meant to be a warning. Instead, it became a monument. In the centuries that followed, Protestant writers would look back on Anne Askew as a martyr of the Reformation. John Foxe included her in Foxe's Book of Martyrs, placing her story alongside the most legendary defenders of the faith. Artists painted her at the stake, authors quoted her trial words, and theologians studied her answers like scripture. But her legacy is more than religious. Anne Askew's story is about what it costs to stand alone, to say no when the world says yes, to keep silent not out of fear, but out of loyalty. She was tortured beyond recognition. She couldn't walk, couldn't lift her arms, couldn't raise her voice, and yet she was louder than any judge in the tower. She became proof that even in a world ruled by kings, guarded by torturers, and chained by tradition, truth could still burn brighter than fear. Her story isn't comfortable. It isn't clean. It's blood and bone and fire. It's a woman tied to a chair because her body had already been torn apart. It's the sound of silence when the rat cracks bones. It's the sight of iron bands holding up a girl too broken to stand as flames climb her dress and crowds gather to watch. That is what the state did to Anne Askew. But that isn't what history remembers. History remembers her words, her courage, her refusal. She didn't die for power. She died for belief, for love of scripture, for love of truth, for love of a faith she believed in more than her own survival. Anne Askew wasn't born to burn, but she burned because she refused to be anything else. And centuries later, we still remember her name. This is torture's room, where silence wasn't protection, it was punishment.